My name is Specialist 4 David Sheets, 2nd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam 1970. I was a machine gunner assigned to Firebase Illingworth, a remote artillery position in Tay Ninh Province near the Cambodian border that existed for exactly 13 days before being hit by one of the largest, most coordinated enemy attacks of the entire war. On the night of April 1st, 1970, and yes, the irony of that date wasn't lost on any of us, approximately 5,000 North Vietnamese Army soldiers from 2 full regiments launched a simultaneous ground assault and rocket barrage against our firebase that killed 24 Americans, wounded another 54, and came within minutes of completely overrunning our position before being stopped by a combination of desperate fighting, point-blank artillery fire, and the kind of courage that only emerges when men realize they're fighting for their lives with no possibility of retreat. This is the story of those 24 hours. Not just the battle itself, but everything leading up to it. The mistakes, the warnings that were ignored, the decisions made by people far from the fighting that put 400 Americans in a position to be attacked by 5,000 enemy soldiers who'd been watching us build that firebase for 2 weeks and planning exactly how they'd destroy it. This is what happens when tactical convenience overrides tactical wisdom. When political timelines drive military operations, when soldiers pay with their lives for strategic decisions made in air-conditioned headquarters hundreds of miles away. Firebase Illingworth was established on March 19, 1970, as a fire support base for ongoing operations against enemy sanctuaries near the Cambodian border. The location was chosen because it provided good artillery coverage of suspected enemy infiltration routes and base areas. What it didn't provide was defensibility. The firebase sat in relatively flat terrain with thick vegetation providing cover right up to the perimeter. There were no natural obstacles, no high ground for observation, no clear fields of fire beyond, maybe 50 yards in any direction. It was, in the professional opinion of every infantry officer and NCO who saw it, an absolutely terrible place to put 400 men and expect them to survive if the enemy decided to hit it hard. I arrived at Illingworth on March 25th as part of a company rotating in to provide perimeter security while the artillery batteries did their work. My first impression walking off the Huey was simple and immediate. We're going to get hit here, and when it happens, it's going to be bad. The perimeter defenses were still being constructed. The bunkers were incomplete. The wire obstacles were minimal. The cleared fields of fire that should have extended 200 yards out from our positions barely extended 50 yards before running in a tree line that could hide an entire battalion. I'd been in Vietnam for 8 months by this point, had seen enough combat to recognize danger, and everything about Illingworth screamed danger. My squad leader was Staff Sergeant James Morrison, a 3-tour veteran who'd been fighting in Vietnam since 1967 and had developed the kind of sixth sense for trouble that only comes from surviving situations where others didn't. When he saw Illingworth for the first time, he said exactly what I was thinking. They're going to hit us. Question is when, not if. And when they do, we better be ready because this place is a death trap. The firebase was roughly circular, maybe 200 meters in diameter, with 6 155mm howitzers positioned in the center providing the main firepower, plus 3 105mm howitzers for closer support. Around the perimeter were fighting positions for 4 infantry companies, about 400 men total when fully manned, though the actual number fluctuated as units rotated in and out for operations. We had .50 caliber machine guns, M60 machine guns, mortars, claymore mines, and whatever personal weapons each soldier carried. Against a squad or platoon-sized probe, these defenses were more than adequate. Against a regimental assault, they were barely sufficient to slow the enemy down. For the first week, nothing happened. We ran patrols during the day, manned defensive positions at night, worked on improving the bunkers and wire obstacles, and watched the jungle that surrounded us on all sides. A few small contacts with enemy scouts or recon teams. Nothing serious. Intelligence kept saying there were 2 NVA regiments operating somewhere in our area. The 272nd and 95C regiments. Estimated combined strength of 5,000 soldiers. but they hadn't been located and nobody seemed particularly concerned about them showing up at our firebase. Morrison was concerned. He spent every spare moment improving our section of the perimeter, reinforcing bunkers with extra sandbags, positioning ammunition where we could reach it quickly in the dark, rehearsing fields of fire with the machine gun crews, preparing for a battle he was certain was coming. Some of the younger soldiers thought he was paranoid, thought he was being overly cautious about a threat that might never materialize. Those of us who'd been around longer knew better. When a veteran infantry NCO with 3 tours tells you to prepare for the worst, you listen because his paranoia is the reason he's still alive after 3 tours. On March 31st, one day before the attack, our patrol started reporting increased signs of enemy presence. Fresh trails in the jungle, observation posts that had been recently occupied, communications wire running through the vegetation, suggesting enemy forces were setting up coordinated positions. The reconnaissance platoon reported seeing what looked like battalion-sized formations moving at night just beyond the range where we could effectively engage them. All the signs were there. The enemy was massing for an attack. They were watching us, studying our defenses, preparing for something big. The battalion commander was briefed on these intelligence indicators. His response was essentially that we were aware of enemy presence, that it was normal for this area, and that we should maintain normal defensive posture and continue our assigned mission. No reinforcements were sent. No additional ammunition or supplies were flown in. No evacuation or repositioning was ordered. We were told to continue operations as planned. That night, March 31st, Morrison gathered our squad in the bunker we'd spent 2 weeks reinforcing and gave us the straight truth. They're coming tonight or tomorrow night. Every sign points to it. Intelligence knows it. The colonel knows it. But nobody's doing anything about it, because admitting we're about to get hit means admitting this firebase shouldn't have been placed here in the first place. So we're on our own. Check your weapons. Check your ammo. Sleep in shifts. Stay alert. And when it starts, fight like your life depends on it, because it does. Around 2,300 hours on March 31st, the firebase settled into night defensive posture. Guard posts were manned. Bunkers were occupied. Claymore mines were armed. Artillery crews slept near their guns, ready to respond to fire missions. The night was quiet, oppressively hot and humid even after sunset, the jungle around us invisible in the darkness beyond our perimeter lights. I was in Bunker 7 on the northeastern section of the perimeter with Morrison and 2 other soldiers from our squad, PFC Marcus Johnson, a kid from Chicago on his first tour, and Specialist Terry Walsh, a farm kid from Kansas who'd been in country for 6 months. We had an M60 machine gun positioned to cover our assigned sector of the perimeter, about 2,000 rounds of linked ammunition, grenades, rifles, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing something bad is about to happen, but not knowing exactly when. Morrison had the first watch. I was supposed to sleep for 2 hours, then relieve him at 0-100. I lay on the bunker floor, M16 within reach, trying to force myself to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Something felt wrong. The jungle was too quiet. The air felt charged with anticipation. Every instinct I developed over 8 months in Vietnam was screaming that danger was close. At 0220 hours on April 1st, 1970, those instincts were proven correct when the first rocket impacted inside Firebase Illingworth, and the worst night of my life began. The sound hit first, a rushing whoosh that gave maybe 2 seconds of warning before the explosion. Then the blast, so close it lifted me off the ground and slammed me against the bunker wall. Before I could process what was happening, more explosions followed in rapid succession. Rockets, dozens of them, impacting across the firebase in a carefully planned barrage that hit command posts, artillery positions, bunkers, ammunition storage, everything that mattered. Incoming! Incoming! Someone screamed on the radio, the transmission cut off mid-word by another explosion. Morrison was already at the machine gun, scanning into the darkness beyond our perimeter. They're coming. Ground assault. Get on the line. I grabbed my rifle, moved to the firing port, looked out into the night. The rocket barrage had killed our perimeter lights. The only illumination came from fires burning across the firebase where rockets had hit fuel supplies and ammunition. In that flickering light, I saw them. Enemy soldiers. Hundreds of them. advancing in waves from the tree line, moving through gaps they'd already cut in our wire obstacles, firing AK-47s as they came, coordinated and disciplined in a way that screamed professional military force, not guerrillas. The M60 opened up, Morrison firing in controlled bursts at the advancing enemy soldiers. I started shooting, picking targets, try to slow the assault that was already inside our perimeter in some sections. Walsh was on the radio, trying to get through to anyone who could coordinate a defense. Johnson was firing as fast as he could work the bolt on his rifle, eyes wide with fear, but still fighting. The sound was overwhelming. Machine guns, rifles, grenades, rockets still impacting, men screaming, enemy soldiers yelling commands in Vietnamese, American soldiers calling for ammunition and medics and reinforcements, the wounded crying out in pain or fear or both. The smell of burning fuel and explosives mixed with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder until the air itself felt toxic. An RPG hit the bunker to our left, collapsed it in an explosion that killed everyone inside instantly. Enemy soldiers rushed toward the gap in our line. Morrison swung the M60 toward them, cut down the first wave, but more kept coming. I threw grenades, fired my rifle until the magazine was empty, reloaded without thinking, fired again. This wasn't aimed fire. This was putting rounds downrange into masses of enemy soldiers who were now close enough that missing was nearly impossible. Then something hit our bunker with tremendous force, and the world went sideways. My ears were ringing. Couldn't hear anything beyond a high-pitched whine. Dust and smoke filled the bunker. I couldn't see Morrison or Walsh or Johnson. Couldn't see anything. Was I wounded? Was I dying? Couldn't tell. Just knew I had to keep fighting because stopping meant dying. I felt hands grab me, pull me upright. Morrison's face appeared through the smoke, mouth moving, shouting something I couldn't hear over the ringing in my ears. He shoved my rifle into my hands, pointed toward the firing port. I understood. Keep shooting. Keep fighting. Don't stop. The battle continued with a kind of desperate intensity I'd never experienced before and hoped never to experience again. Every minute felt like an hour. Every decision, shoot this enemy soldier or that one, throw the grenade now or save it, reload or fix the jam, felt like it determined whether we'd survive the next 60 seconds. There was no grand strategy, no tactical brilliance, just the brutal mathematics of close-range combat, where whoever could put more steel into the enemy faster had the advantage. At some point, I lost all track of time during the fighting. I heard a different sound, deeper, heavier than small arms. The Firebase's artillery batteries were firing, not at distant targets, at the enemy soldiers inside our perimeter. The 155mm howitzers were being leveled flat and fired directly at NVA troops who were literally climbing over our bunkers. The concussion from those guns firing at point-blank range was like being hit by a truck. The effects on enemy soldiers caught in the open were catastrophic. I saw an entire enemy squad simply cease to exist when a 155mm round detonated among them. The artillery fire broke the assault. Enemy soldiers who'd been pushing forward into our position started pulling back, retreating to the tree line, dragging casualties with them. The pressure on our section of the perimeter eased enough that I could take a breath, assess the damage, check on the rest of my squad. Morrison was wounded, shrapnel in his left arm and face, bleeding heavily but still conscious and fighting. Walsh was dead, killed by the RPG that had hit our bunker. Johnson was unhurt physically but in shock, staring at nothing, not responding when I spoke to him. Our M60 was damaged but still functional. We had maybe 500 rounds of ammunition left. Half our grenades were gone. The bunker itself was partially collapsed and wouldn't survive another direct hit. Around us, Firebase Illingworth was a scene of devastation. Bunkers destroyed, artillery pieces damaged, fires burning everywhere, bodies, American and enemy, scattered across the perimeter, wounded men calling for medics who were themselves wounded or dead. The command post had taken a direct hit from a rocket. Half our .50 caliber positions were destroyed. We'd been hit hard, hit worse than any firebase I'd heard of surviving. But we were still here, still fighting, still alive. Morrison tied a bandage around his arm, winced at the pain, then checked the M60 to make sure it would fire. That was their first assault, he said, his voice hoarse. They'll be back. Probably wait until just before dawn when we're exhausted. We need to prepare. Check ammunition. Get more grenades from any bunker that's still intact. Redistribute defenders to fill gaps in the line. We have maybe 2 hours before they come again. He was right. The enemy hadn't quit, hadn't been defeated. They'd pulled back to regroup, treat their casualties, prepare for another assault. And we had to use the time we'd been given to prepare to survive it. I spent the next 2 hours doing exactly what Morrison ordered. Scavenged ammunition from damaged bunkers and dead soldiers. Felt horrible doing it, taking ammo from corpses, but the living needed it more than the dead. Helped move wounded to the aid station that was itself partially destroyed. Reinforced what remained of our bunker. Prepared for the second assault that intelligence, what remained of it after the command post was hit, said would come with even more force than the first. At 0445 hours, just as the sky was beginning to lighten with pre-dawn glow, the rockets started again. Not as many as the first barrage, but targeted more precisely at our artillery positions and surviving bunkers. They'd watched the first assault, identified which positions were still functional, and now they were systematically destroying what remained of our defenses. Then came the ground assault, bigger than the first, more coordinated. Enemy soldiers attacking from 3 sides simultaneously, using the destroyed sections of our perimeter to penetrate deep into the firebase, fighting their way toward the artillery batteries that were the real strategic objective. If they could destroy or capture our guns, Illingworth would be indefensible and would have to be evacuated, handing the enemy a significant tactical and propaganda victory. We fought them in the bunkers, in the gaps between positions, in hand-to-hand combat when ammunition ran low and weapons jammed. I saw soldiers fighting with entrenching tools, with knives, with fists and rocks when everything else failed. Saw Morrison, wounded, exhausted, running on nothing but will and stubborn refusal to die. Personally kill at least 6 enemy soldiers at close range with his pistol when the M60 finally jammed beyond quick repair. Saw Johnson snap out of his shock and start fighting like a man possessed, throwing himself at enemy soldiers who'd gotten into our bunker, buying seconds with his life so Morrison and I could regroup and counterattack. The artillery saved us again. The gun crews, despite taking casualties, despite having their positions overrun, kept their guns firing. When enemy soldiers got too close for conventional fire, they loaded beehive rounds, anti-personnel ammunition that turned the 155mm howitzers into gigantic shotguns, firing thousands of flechettes that shredded everything in front of the gun. The sound was horrific. The effects were apocalyptic. And it worked. The enemy assault stalled, broke, retreated again. As dawn fully broke on April 1st, we counted the cost. 24 Americans killed, 54 wounded, many seriously. 4 artillery pieces damaged or destroyed. A third of our bunkers collapsed or unusable. Ammunition down to critically low levels. Medical supplies nearly exhausted. The firebase itself was barely functional, held together by determination and the refusal of exhausted soldiers to give up. But we'd held. Against 2 regimental assaults by an enemy force that outnumbered us more than 10-1, we'd held. The enemy had withdrawn into the jungle, leaving hundreds of their own dead scattered across the approaches to our position. Intelligence would later estimate enemy casualties at over 400 killed and several hundred more wounded. We'd inflicted a tactical defeat on 2 NVA regiments that had expected to overrun us in the first assault. The price was terrible. 24 families would get telegrams. 54 soldiers would carry scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Firebase Illingworth would be abandoned 3 days later, deemed too damaged and too exposed to continue operations, making all those deaths and wounds feel like sacrifices for terrain we'd surrender anyway. But we'd held. For 24 hours, against impossible odds, we'd fought and survived. And that had to mean something, had to count for something, even if I'm still trying to figure out what that something is, 55 years later. Act 2. The hours after the second assault ended were among the strangest of my entire tour. The firebase was devastated, barely functional as a military position, but we were still alive, and the enemy had withdrawn, so technically we'd won. Soldiers moved through the wreckage in a daze, trying to process what had just happened, trying to help wounded friends, trying to collect the dead with whatever dignity remained possible in a place that looked like the surface of the moon after an artillery barrage. Morrison's wounds were worse than he'd let on during the fighting. The shrapnel in his arm had severed something important. He couldn't move his fingers properly, and the bleeding wouldn't stop completely despite the bandages. The medics told him he needed to be evacuated, needed surgery in a real hospital, but he refused. "I'm staying until every soldier in my squad is accounted for and the perimeter is secure," he said, and nothing the medic said could change his mind. That's the kind of NCO he was. The kind who'd bleed out before abandoning his men. I helped organize what remained of our squad. Walsh was dead. We'd already moved his body to the collection point where the dead were being gathered for evacuation. Johnson was physically unhurt but psychologically shattered, sitting against a bunker wall, staring at nothing, occasionally shaking like he was cold despite the heat. The two other members of our squad who'd been in different positions during the battle had survived with minor wounds. Out of 6 men, 1 dead, 1 seriously wounded, 1 broken, 3 functioning but exhausted beyond anything I'd experienced before. We weren't unique. Every unit on that firebase had similar casualty rates. Some worse. The artillery batteries had taken horrific casualties. Crew members killed at their guns, positions overrun and retaken in close combat, equipment destroyed. 1 gun crew had been reduced to just 2 men who'd kept their 155mm howitzer firing throughout the battle despite being surrounded by enemy soldiers, firing the gun manually when electrical systems were damaged, loading shells by hand while taking rifle fire from 20 yards away. The command structure was chaos. The battalion commander had been wounded in the first rocket barrage. The executive officer had been killed. Company commanders and platoon leaders were dead or wounded. The defense of Firebase Illingworth had largely been conducted by NCOs and junior officers making local decisions, coordinating by shouting to adjacent positions because radios were damaged or jammed, holding sections of perimeter through individual courage rather than coordinated tactics. Around 0800 hours, helicopter gunships arrived overhead. Cobra attacked helicopters that had been scrambled from other bases when Illingworth radioed that we were under mass assault. They'd been trying to get to us all night, but weather and darkness and enemy anti-aircraft fire had delayed them. Now they circled the firebase, searching for remaining enemy forces, providing top cover in case the NVA decided to launch another assault. The sight of those Cobras overhead, knowing that air support was finally available, though we weren't completely alone anymore, broke something in me. I sat down in the ruins of our bunker and started shaking. Not from fear. The fear had been constant during the battle, and I'd functioned through it. This was different. This was the delayed reaction, the body and mind finally processing what they'd been through, the realization that I should be dead, that by every reasonable calculation I should have been killed in that bunker when the RPG hit or in the dozens of other moments when death came within inches. Morrison found me there, saw what was happening, and didn't say anything. Just sat down next to me, put his good hand on my shoulder, and waited until the shaking stopped. "It's okay," he finally said. "Means you're human. Means you're processing. The guys who don't shake, who don't react, who just keep going like nothing happened, those are the ones I worry about. You'll be all right." I wanted to believe him. Wanted to think that this would just be another experience I'd integrate and move past. But I knew, in the way you know things that are true even when you don't want to acknowledge them, that Firebase Illingworth had changed something fundamental. That the person who'd arrived at this firebase 2 weeks ago wasn't the same person who'd survived the battle. That combat, real combat where you fight for your life against an enemy who wants you dead, changes you in ways that can't be undone or explained to people who haven't experienced it. Throughout the morning, helicopters began arriving to evacuate the seriously wounded. Priority went to the worst casualties, soldiers who die without immediate surgery, soldiers missing limbs or with catastrophic injuries, soldiers burned when fuel supplies were hit. The medevac pilots flew into Firebase Illingworth, knowing it was probably still under enemy observation, knowing that anti-aircraft guns might open up on them, knowing that another assault could start while they were on the ground. They came anyway. That's what those pilots did. Flew into places no sane person would go because soldiers needed them. Morrison was evacuated on the 3rd medevac flight. He argued, tried to stay, but by that point he'd lost enough blood that he couldn't stand without assistance, and the medics physically carried him to the helicopter. Before they loaded him on, he grabbed my arm with his good hand. "Take care of Johnson," he said. "Kid's broken, but he can be fixed if someone helps him. And Sheets, you did good. You fought smart. You kept your head when things got bad. That's why you're alive. Remember that." Then he was gone, loaded onto the Huey that lifted off immediately and banked away toward the field hospital. I never saw him again. Heard later that he survived, was medically retired due to the severity of his wounds, went home to his family in North Carolina. Hope he had a good life. He deserved it after 3 tours of fighting in this war. By afternoon of April 1st, Firebase Illingworth had been reinforced. Fresh infantry companies arrived by helicopter, bringing ammunition, medical supplies, engineers to repair damaged bunkers and artillery pieces. The firebase went from barely functional to reasonably secure in about 6 hours, which raised the obvious question. Why hadn't these reinforcements been sent earlier when intelligence indicated an attack was imminent? Why had we been left with minimal forces against a known threat? The answer, as far as any of us could determine, was the usual mixture of command failures, resource constraints, and political considerations that characterized much of the Vietnam War. Higher command hadn't wanted to admit the firebase was vulnerable because admitting vulnerability meant admitting the firebase shouldn't have been placed there. Resources were spread thin across multiple operations, and concentrating forces at Illingworth would have meant weakening other positions. And there were political pressures. The war was winding down, American forces were being drawn down, every decision was filtered through considerations about how it would play in Washington and in the American media. So 400 soldiers had been placed in an indefensible position, given minimal resources to defend it, left there despite clear intelligence that a major attack was coming, and told to hold. 24 died because of those decisions. 54 were wounded. The survivors were changed in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. And 3 days later, the firebase we bled for was abandoned anyway, bulldozed and evacuated, the terrain turned back over to enemy control as if the battle had never happened. That's the part that makes it hard to find meaning in what we went through. If Firebase Illingworth had been strategically critical, if holding it had prevented enemy offensives or protected important territory, if the American soldiers who died there had died for something that mattered in the larger context of the war, then maybe their deaths could be understood as necessary sacrifices. But Illingworth wasn't strategically critical. It existed briefly, got hit hard, was abandoned. The tactical victory we achieved by holding against the NVA assault didn't translate into any strategic gain. We'd won the battle and lost nothing but lives and time. On April 2nd, one day after the battle, I was pulled from Illingworth and sent to a rear area for what they call combat stress evaluation. Standard procedure after intense combat. Make sure soldiers aren't completely broken before sending them back to the field. I spent 3 days at a base camp being evaluated by psychologists who'd never been in combat and couldn't possibly understand what we'd been through. They asked questions about nightmares, about intrusive thoughts, about my ability to function. I gave them the answers they wanted to hear, that I was fine, that I could handle it, that I was ready to return to my unit. It was all lies. I wasn't fine. Couldn't sleep without seeing enemy soldiers rushing the bunker. Couldn't hear loud noises without flinching. Couldn't relax because part of me was still on that perimeter expecting the next assault. But admitting any of that meant being pulled from combat duty, maybe being sent home early, and that felt like abandoning my unit, abandoning the soldiers who'd survived Firebase Illingworth alongside me. So I lied, passed the evaluation, got sent back to my company. I spent the remaining 4 months of my tour in Vietnam functioning on autopilot, going through the motions of being a soldier while something essential inside remained frozen on the night of April 1st. Did my job, followed orders, survived, but I wasn't really there anymore. The part of me that had been fully present, fully engaged with life, had been left in Bunker 7 at Firebase Illingworth, and I didn't get it back until years later through therapy and time and the gradual acceptance that surviving combat doesn't mean emerging unchanged. Act 3. I came home from Vietnam in August 1970, for months after Firebase Illingworth. Flew from Saigon to Travis Air Force Base in California, processed out of the military, put on civilian clothes, and tried to resume the life I'd left when I deployed 13 months earlier. It didn't work. Couldn't work. The person who'd left was different from the person who'd returned, and pretending otherwise just delayed the inevitable reckoning with what combat had done to me. The nightmares started immediately. Every night, sometimes multiple times per night, I'd be back at Illingworth. Back in Bunker 7 with Morrison and Walsh and Johnson, hearing the rockets come in, seeing the enemy soldiers rushing our position, fighting in the desperate knowledge that we were outnumbered and outgunned, and the only question was whether we'd survive the next minute. I'd wake up gasping, covered in sweat, sometimes shouting, my girlfriend at the time terrified because I'd been reaching for weapons that weren't there, preparing to fight enemies who existed only in my mind. The hypervigilance was constant. Couldn't sit with my back to a door. Couldn't be in crowds without scanning for threats. Loud noises, cars backfiring, fireworks, construction sounds sent me into immediate panic mode, looking for cover, preparing for incoming fire. My body and mind were still at war, even though the war was 10,000 miles away, and I was supposedly safe in suburban America. The guilt was worst. Survivor's guilt, the therapist called it years later. The constant question of why I'd survived when Walsh died, when Morrison was crippled, when Johnson broke, when 24 Americans were killed defending a firebase that was abandoned 3 days later. What made me special? What made me deserving of survival when others weren't? I couldn't answer those questions. Still can't. Just know that they haunted me, made it hard to enjoy life or find meaning or connect with people who hadn't been through what I'd been through. I tried to talk about it once, at a family gathering, maybe 6 months after I'd returned. Tried to explain what Firebase Illingworth had been like, what combat does to you, why I couldn't just move on like everyone kept suggesting. The response was awkward silence, followed by someone changing the subject to something more comfortable. I learned quickly that civilian America in 1970 didn't want to hear about Vietnam, didn't want to know what soldiers had experienced, wanted us to come home, shut up, and pretend the war had never happened. So I did what many Vietnam veterans did. I stopped talking about it, buried it, tried to function in civilian life while carrying trauma I couldn't acknowledge or process. Got a job, got married eventually, built a life that looked normal from the outside while being fundamentally fractured on the inside. It took decades to begin healing, decades of therapy, of veteran support groups, of slowly learning that what I'd experienced at Firebase Illingworth wasn't something I needed to be ashamed of or hide. That surviving combat and being changed by it didn't make me weak or broken. That the nightmares and hypervigilance and guilt were normal responses to abnormal situations. That I could honor the memory of the soldiers who died without being consumed by guilt that I'd survived. I'm 74 years old now. Firebase Illingworth was 55 years ago. More than half a century has passed since that night in April 1970, when I fought for my life in a bunker on a firebase that no longer exists in a war that America lost, and most people barely remember. But I remember every detail. Remember Morrison's face when he gave orders while bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Remember Walsh's body being carried from our bunker. Remember Johnson's 1,000-yard stare after the fighting ended. Remember the sound of enemy soldiers shouting in Vietnamese as they rushed our position. Remember the smell of burning fuel and explosives and blood. Remember the taste of fear, metallic and overwhelming, that filled my mouth during the worst moments when I was certain I was about to die. And I remember the soldiers who didn't come home. 24 names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall who died at Firebase Illingworth on April 1st, 1970. 24 men who were somebody's son, many of them somebody's husband or father or brother. 24 lives cut short defending a position that was abandoned 3 days after they died for it. Their names deserve to be remembered. Captain George Hobson, 26, from Ohio, commander of Alpha Company, killed in the first rocket barrage while coordinating the defense. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, 29, from Texas, artillery section chief, killed at his gun while loading a beehive round. Specialist 4 Raymond Cooper, 21, from Georgia, machine gunner, killed repelling the second assault. Private First Class Terry Walsh, 20, from Kansas, my friend, killed in Bunker 7 when an RPG hit our position. And 20 others whose names I read every time I visit the wall, whose faces I see in old photographs, whose stories I carry because someone needs to remember that they lived, that they fought, that they mattered. Firebase Illingworth is gone now. The location where it stood is probably jungle again, Nature reclaiming the scarred earth where 400 Americans fought 5,000 enemy soldiers for 24 hours in April 1970. There's no memorial there, no marker to indicate what happened, nothing to tell future generations that men died on that ground defending each other and their brothers in arms. But I remember, and as long as I'm alive, their story lives. The story of Firebase Illingworth, the mistakes that created it, the courage that defended it, the sacrifice that held it, and the 24 soldiers who died there for reasons that still don't make sense 55 years later. This is what happened on April 1st, 1970. This is what it cost. This is what I carry. My name is David Sheets. I survived Firebase Illingworth. 24 others didn't. This is their story as much as mine. This is what combat means. This is what war does to the soldiers who fight it and the families who lose them. This is the truth that doesn't fit into political speeches or strategic assessments or history books that reduce battles to statistics and casualty counts. 24 Americans died at Firebase Illingworth defending a position that was abandoned 3 days later. I survived, and I've spent 55 years trying to understand why, trying to find meaning in their deaths, trying to honor their memory by telling the truth about what we went through. This is that truth. This is Firebase Illingworth. This is what happened to us.